Now that we've discussed how to enumerate Microsoft Windows, let's talk a little bit about Linux enumeration. Now you can enumerate Linux, but you won't get always the same amount of information out of a Linux box as you might out of a Windows box or Windows network, and you'll use different tools and techniques. Some of the same information you can get include possibly usernames. If there are applications that may use default passwords, you may get those. You also may be able to determine if there are null passwords in use or blank passwords. In some cases, you can get permission information about what permissions are set on certain key directories and files. You also may get share information. If Linux is sharing out any resources over the network, you can get information about the shares. Now, if Linux is using Samba, which is the Windows equivalent to SMB, and helps Linux communicate with the Windows network and share files, you may get information about the shares and even the Windows network itself. In some cases, Linux or Unix may be using NFS to share files across a Linux or Unix type of network. You may get information from those NFS shares, such as mounts, permissions, and so forth. You also may get the typical network service information. Again, we talked about DNS, LDAP, SMTP, and other services that are possible. Now, obviously, Linux and Unix use different tools and techniques. Some of the commands that are built in may help you, although some of these commands have been deprecated over the years and may not be on your particular Linux or Unix distribution that you're using. You may have to download these. These can include commands like rpc info, rpc client, finger, which is an older command. Also, show mount might show you any mounted shares on the system. There are also typical built-in commands and utilities with Unix and Linux, such as who am I, and ID. Now, we can look at some of these commands and run them individually, but it may help if you use a particular enumeration script, and I'm going to show you a couple of those during this next demonstration. Okay, we're back in our CentOS box, and what I want to show you is a couple of built-in commands first, and those are rpc info, which you can run and get information on the different ports and services that your Linux box is using. And this is all the ports that are using remote procedure call, the port mappers. And so you can get a little bit of information and know what they're running on them. And you would have to interpret this information and figure out exactly what it's running and how and why. Another one might be finger, and finger has largely been deprecated on most systems. But if you can finger a host, what you're doing is looking to see if you can get usernames and log in information on those hosts. And again, finger has basically been deprecated. You won't even find it installed on a lot of Linux or Unix hosts. Now, another way you can do some enumeration on Linux is to run some of the scripts that are out there that will help you do this. And one of them is actually one called Linux that's out there. It's a pretty good little enumeration type of script, and it basically gives you the option to enumerate a local host, and if you can get access remotely through SSH or Telnet, you can run it on a host remotely as well. Let's run it and see what we get off of it. And you can actually type in keywords to look for as well and get output so you can analyze it later. And I would recommend that you do that because it actually puts a lot of output on the screen. So if you want to search for something called password, for example, in these different files, you can do that. And it's giving you permission information. It's going to give you information on the shares, on the different services that are running, on the modules that are loaded. So we'll actually enumerate your Linux box very well. It's very thorough. Unfortunately, it's more of a locally executed script. So unless you can get remote access through SSH or Telnet, you can't run it remotely. But it will tell you if permissions are inadequately set. It'll tell you details on NFS. It'll tell you if it can read roots, history files, and mail, and so forth. So you'll get a lot of interesting information. And again, that's linenum. Now there's another script out there that you can find fairly easily, and it's enum for Linux. And this can do remote enumeration, and it can enumerate Linux boxes that are running Samba or Windows networks. And that's really the big thing, is it's based on Samba. So if you don't have Samba running, you won't get anything off of this particular command. So let's switch directories to enum. And basically it's a Perl script. So you would type in Perl enum, and you want to give an IP address. And I'm going to give it an address of our Windows box. And we can do different options like -u, -p, for example. and see what we get out of it. And it will enumerate. It'll try to tell you the SIDs or RIDs. It'll tell you it'll use known usernames that are out there. It'll try to find workgroup and domain information, policy information, and so forth. So all the different things you can get out of enumerating a Windows box, you could probably get out of this particular script, assuming you had the right modules loaded. And some of these aren't loaded for this particular box, but you'll see that you can get a little bit of information using the enum for Linux. Now, if Samba were loaded on another Linux box, you could also get that kind of information from the Linux box as well. And again, this is a box that's connected to a Windows network that's sharing resources with Windows. That's really what enum for Linux gives you, is Samba information. So it didn't really get a lot of information out of our Windows box. It's a little bit of an older script, and you see that it's missing some Python modules, so you'll have to have those loaded to get the particular things you want out of it. So that's enum for Linux. Again, it can have varying results depending upon what's loaded on your box and what you're after. Those are a couple of scripts and a couple of commands that you can use to enumerate Linux.